What are the perspectives of Judge Andrew Napolitano on the critical importance of civil liberties? Join Richard Ebeling and me and our special guest, Judge Andrew Napolitano, in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, part of our special 6 presentation series entitled The Critical Importance of Civil Liberties. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, as well as our very special honored guest, Judge Andrew Napolitano. And if there's anybody that does not need an introduction, at least among libertarians, it's Judge Napolitano, but I'll give you one anyway, Judge. Judge Napolitano was a former senior judicial analyst for Fox News, where I'm sure most of y'all discovered him. He was also the head of a great program called Freedom Watch, which back in the day was bringing hardcore libertarians to mainstream America. It was really one of the most exciting times in the history of television, as far as I'm concerned. He's now the host of a very popular, extremely popular podcast called Judging Freedom. He's the author of 9 books on the Constitution, 2 of which have been New York Times bestsellers. We all know that a statist president and a statist Congress or Senate would never confirm a libertarian lawyer to the federal bench, including the U.S. Supreme Court. But if they ever did, there's no question that Judge Napolitano would be in the top 5, if not top of the 5, lawyers to be considered for that position. He spoke at our 2007 conference, which is online in the multimedia section of our website. Fantastic talk, fantastic conference. Judge, I can't tell you what an honor it is to have you back with us. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on to Libertarian Angle and share your perspectives on this critical importance of civil liberties.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure to be with my longtime friend, Professor Richard Ebeling, and I welcome the questions that the two of you may put to me. I've been teaching about the Constitution for a long time. I was at Fox News for 24 years. I was also on 3 different law school faculties, Widener University, Seton Hall University, and Brooklyn Law School for a total of 16 years. It's hard to overstate the significance of civil liberties to the American experience. If you begin with the Declaration of Independence, it of course weds the country at its very birth, July 4th, 1776, to the concept of natural rights, when Jefferson argues that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Natural rights, of course, teaches that our rights come from our humanity. Now, whether you believe that our humanity is a gift from God, or whether you believe that human beings are the highest and best creatures in existence, you can accept the argument that our rights come from our humanity, from within us. They pre-exist the government. Madison himself was, of course, of that view. He articulated that view in the 9th Amendment among the Bill of Rights, which is probably the least understood, but it basically says that the rights, he has this argument with Alexander Hamilton about listing rights. And Madison says, I can list 20 rights that everybody has. And Hamilton says, and then I can list another 20 and you'll list another 20. How can you possibly list all the human rights that are immune from government interference? So they listed the ones that we all know about in the first 8 amendments of the Bill of Rights. The original Bill of Rights was longer than the one that was actually adopted, but the one that was adopted, that we refer to as the Bill of Rights, has the civil liberties with which we're all familiar. You can think as you wish. You can say what you think. You can publish what you say. You can worship or not worship. The government cannot interfere with the worship, nor can it unduly support the worship. You can associate with whomever you want or not associate with whomever you want. Your right to think as you wish and say what you think is also your right to remain silent. All of these rights are encompassed in just the First Amendment. Proceeding on, you can defend yourself, according to Justice Scalia, using the same means as the government does or the bad guys do. Now, that's a very, very significant statement. Can you own a tank? Because the government obviously owns tanks. Justice Scalia didn't address that, but he made it clear that the right to keep and bear arms enables you to resist not only the bad guys, but the government. So we'll put aside whether or not you can own a tank. That's like how many angels are on the head of a pin. But clearly, you can own weapons of the level of sophistication that the government has. Otherwise, your ability to resist a tyrant is meaningless. The Third Amendment, of course, is housing troops on private property without the consent of the owner. This rarely comes up. It comes up in the modern era when there are major conflagrations at prisons, and the government needs to bring in many, many more law enforcement and even military personnel to quell the conflict at the prison. The conflict goes on for a couple of days, and they need a place for the newly arrived troops to stay somewhere. This is actually a real case that happened in Attica, New York, at the famous Attica prison riots in the 1970s. And the court, of course, compelled the government to pay massive amounts of compensation because it basically threw people out of their homes and put the troops in there. The Third Amendment prohibits that. The Fourth Amendment is quintessentially the most American. I will characterize it as the right to be left alone. Justice Brandeis called it the right to be let alone. And it is, of course, the right to privacy. It is the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. Those are the four areas that when the government wants to invade privacy, persons, houses, papers, or effects, it must obtain a warrant from a judge demonstrating under oath probable cause, meaning that it is more likely than not that in the papers, houses, persons, or effects, I'm saying persons because it includes arrest and it includes intrusion into what a person might have in their clothing. When the government wants to arrest someone or wants to invade houses, papers, or effects, it, of course, must present evidence that it is more likely than not that evidence of crime will be found there. And then a judge signs the warrant, and the warrant must specifically describe the place to be searched or the person or thing to be seized. The reason for the specificity requirement is because of the colonists' dreadful experience with general warrants issued by secret courts in Britain. Now, a general warrant did not specifically describe the place to be searched or the person or thing to be seized. Rather, it authorized the bearer of the warrant, usually a British agent, occasionally a British soldier, to search wherever he wished and seize whatever he found. Now, these general warrants were most ordered or authorized by the secret court in London in order to address the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was legislation enacted in 1765 and then repealed by Parliament in 1766, just a year later, in which the legislation required that every piece of paper in the possession of the colonists, every medical document, every legal document, every financial document, even letters, even pamphlets, even posters about to be nailed to a tree, had to bear the king's stamp. Where did you get the king's stamp? You went to a British agent in the 13 colonies and paid for the stamp. It wasn't a stamp like a postage stamp. It was a stamp like a rubber stamp. It was actually a stencil with a British seal that was put on the paper, and then paint was put over the stencil so that what remained on the paper was the seal showing that you had paid for the stamp. When some very smart students at the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton University — I smile because I'm an alumnus of Princeton — calculated that it cost the government more to enforce the Stamp Act than was generated in revenue by the sale of the stamps, the colonists realized revenue was not the goal of this legislation. The goal of this legislation was to use the general warrants to get into the homes of colonists looking for revolutionary material, ostensibly looking for the stamps, but really looking for the Sam Adamses and Thomas Jeffersons and Benjamin Franklin's among them as to who was planning and plotting the revolution, which would come 10 years later. Parliament rescinded the Stamp Act because the American colonists were very violent against the British agents who came and the British agents who sold the stamps. But Parliament did not rescind the general warrants. That's called the Writs of Assistance Act. That was never rescinded by Parliament. It was, of course, abrogated once the Declaration of Independence was signed and once the Treaty of Paris was signed, which ended formally the British dominance over the colonies. The Fifth Amendment, of course, prohibits the government from taking life, liberty, or property from any person, keyword person, without due process of law. I say keyword person because the Fifth Amendment is very much in play today as the Trump administration takes the position that persons not in the United States legally are not protected by due process. The courts have ruled to the contrary. The courts have ruled that because the Fifth Amendment uses the word persons rather than Americans, it applies to every human being in the United States, no matter how they got here. So if the government wants to deport you because it doesn't like the speech you use at Columbia University and it's going to rescind your student visa, or it wants to deport you because you overstayed a visa, or it wants to deport you because you came here illegally, it doesn't matter what the basis for that deportation is. You're entitled to a hearing because all persons are entitled to due process whenever the government wants to take life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. And obviously kicking somebody out of the country is impairing their liberty. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to a jury trial. The Seventh Amendment guarantees the right to confront the evidence against you. The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive fines. We had a case just the other day of excessive fines. A retired police officer in Tennessee, harshly critical of those who have been lionizing the late Charlie Kirk, and he made his criticisms well known. He took a statement out of context used by President Trump and claimed that Trump was using it about the people lionizing Kirk, and a local sheriff somehow construed that statement, "Let's get over it, let's turn the page," as a threat to shoot up a school. There was no threat whatsoever, and there was no logical nexus. I make this point because a state judge in Tennessee imposed a $2 million bail on this police officer who's retired and lives on Social Security and a pension, in direct violation of the Eighth Amendment, which says that the bail has to be reasonable. It has to be what the person can make. It can't be so far beyond their means as to be no bail whatsoever. This, of course, brings us to the ninth. Now we're back to where we started, the verbal discourse between Hamilton and Madison. Madison wanted to list rights that the government couldn't interfere with. Hamilton didn't want to list any rights because the father of big government was of the fanciful and absurd view that the government wouldn't take people's rights and the courts wouldn't allow them to do it. we ended up with the Ninth Amendment, which basically says the rights listed above are not all the rights retained by the people. And those other rights retained by the people may not be disparaged by any government, state or federal. I'm paraphrasing. Significant because it references the existence of rights not enumerated. Well, if they're not enumerated, where did they come from? According to Madison and Jefferson, there are natural rights. They came from our humanity. Madison, of course, is the key figure here, more so than Jefferson, because Madison is the scrivener at the Constitutional Convention. He keeps the notes and he drafts huge chunks of the Constitution. Madison's a little bit of a scurrilous character here, as well as a brilliant one, because the purpose of the Constitutional Convention, as stated when the delegates were sent there, was to amend the Articles of Confederation. Madison showed up with an entire new constitution, not the one that was adopted, but close to the one that was adopted. And that began the debates that resulted in the debates being behind closed doors. That resulted, of course, in the Constitution, which was eventually ratified by the states. 5 years later, Madison is a congressman in the House of Representatives. Small fun fact, one of his constituents is Thomas Jefferson, who in this era is the Secretary of State. So we're just 2 years into the presidency of George Washington when Madison is tasked with being chair of the House Committee to draft the Bill of Rights. They have an argument over the First Amendment, and it's over one word. Now, when I was teaching law school, I would throw this out. Which is the most significant word in the following phrase? Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Well, it's a trick question because the most important word there is the. I'll repeat it. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Madison insisted that the word the be in there in order to reflect that the freedom of speech pre-existed the government. If it pre-existed the government, where did it come from? Well, it exists in nature. It exists without government. In nature, with no government, with just the neighbors that you know and love, your family members, you can think as you wish and say what you think and publish what you say because you have the natural right to do so. So by insisting on the word the, Madison was attempting to manifest to posterity the understanding of the ratifiers that the freedom of speech, as well as the other rights in the first 8 amendments, were natural to our humanity. This, of course, goes back to John Locke, who made the argument that individuals are sovereign. And this, of course, then goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas, who made the argument that our rights are natural. This is an argument which you rarely hear in courts today. My friends who sit in appellate courts, even my friends that are on the Supreme Court, I ask them, does anybody ever make a natural law argument? No. The last time we heard a natural law argument was when you made it on television. That's their usual their usual response. I wrote a treatise on this. It's actually my 10th book called Freedom's Anchor, an introduction to natural law jurisprudence in American constitutional history. It's about 400 pages. It has 2,000 footnotes. I'm very proud of the footnotes. I don't expect anybody to read them, but if you want to know the universe of everything written on natural rights in the English language up to 2023, when the book was published, it's all there in the footnotes. We examined every Supreme Court opinion that expressly accepts the concept of natural rights and expressly rejects the concept of natural rights and waffles as to whether it's accepting or rejecting. And we analyzed those opinions. It is true that natural law jurisprudence is rarely argued today, but it is also true that it is a fundamental truism of the founding fathers. It is true that the values underlying the First Amendment mean that the government may never evaluate the content of speech and act on those contents, that it is none of the government's business what we say. Now, I'm not talking about somebody with a bullhorn at 3 o'clock in the morning in a residential neighborhood in a quiet suburb. Obviously, the government can regulate time, place, and manner, but only because of time, place, and manner, not because of the content of speech. 2 months ago, President Trump signed an executive order decreeing that flag burning your own flag, is a federal crime. Now, it is, of course, absurd for the president to do this, not only because the Supreme Court, in two opinions, one involving the state of Texas and one involving congressional legislation, invalidated both legislations, saying the flag stands for the right to burn it, but also absurd that the president of the United States would think that he can craft a crime. We know from the separation of powers that only Congress can craft crimes, and the president's duty is to enforce the laws that Congress has crafted, enacted, legislated, not to enforce laws that he wishes Congress had crafted, legislated, or enacted. We have a president who a year ago enjoyed the support of many of our libertarian friends, and today they wish they could withdraw that support because he has manifested an incredible indifference to the Bill of Rights. He has punished people for speech. He has attempted to deny due process. He has even killed people who he says are bad and evil people not entitled to due process. So we are confronting very, very dark days with respect to civil liberties. The highest right, of course, is the right to live. And the ratifiers recognize that in the Fifth Amendment. Are the people in boats 1,500 miles off the coast of the United States entitled to due process? Well, of course they are. The Supreme Court ruled in 5 decisions, all following 9/11 and Guantanamo, that wherever the government goes, the Constitution goes with it. If Congress had declared war on the country from which these people came, and if they were legitimate military agents of that country, there would be no need for due process because the declaration of war obviates due process. But the president himself has said these people are criminals. Well, if they are criminals, they are entitled to be arrested and determine what evidence there is. And if there's no evidence of crime, to be set free. Instead, the president has killed them. But he does have a headache on his hands because Pete Hegseth's killers failed to kill 2 people. So there are 2 living, healthy survivors of these destruction of these speedboats who have very legitimate causes of action against the president and against his administration for attempted murder and for kidnapping. I say kidnapping because they were arrested and the government didn't know what to do with them. And then it realized it didn't even know their names and it had no evidence of crime, so it had to let them go. So they deported them to the countries from which they came, neither of which came from Venezuela. And then those countries said, well, we can't hold them. We have no evidence against them. The Americans who brought them here didn't have any evidence against them. So you have a foreign country following due process with the same human beings against which the United States of America declined to follow a due process. I almost wish that the government had not sent them back to the countries from which they came. Then we would have had a real hot potato on our hands because then the government would have had to commence an action against them. It would have had to come up with evidence. And then, of course, they could challenge the way the government got the evidence by killing them from the skies or attempting to kill them from the skies. But wanting to avoid this mess, the government sent them home. Problem with all this killing is it becomes precedent. President Trump relies on President Obama, who famously used drones to kill Anwar al-Awlaki and his son. I forget the son's first name, but both of them were born in the United States. Mr. al-Awlaki, the father, his father, brought an action against President Obama in federal court in Washington, D.C. to enjoin the murder of his son. Justice Department said, "What are you, crazy? There are no plans to murder the son." And the federal judge said, "Well, you're the father of the son. You don't even have standing. If your son was here in court, he would have standing. But you don't, because there's no threat against you." So the case was dismissed not on the merits, but on the absence of standing. Standing is a requirement the Constitution has to prevent the courts from willy-nilly saying this is right, this is wrong, this is yes, this is no, this is stop, this is go. There has to be a real live case or controversy before the court, and the person bringing the case has to have a real grievance distinct from all others. Mr. al-Awlaki was never even charged with a crime, though he was followed by 12 intelligence agents for the final 48 hours of his life. They couldn't arrest him because there was no charge, no indictment. But under the Obama logic, they could kill him. Trump apparently has used the same logic. I say apparently because when Obama killed al-Awlaki, a lot of us, including I at Fox, pounded the table for what is your authority? What is your authority? What is your authority? And some brave soul working for the Justice Department leaked the memorandum. It was a joke. It would have flunked the first year of law school. It analogized killing al-Awlaki to police shooting back at bank robbers who were shooting at them. Well, al-Awlaki was never charged with a crime, as I said, and he wasn't engaged in an act of violence at the time of his murder. He was sitting having tea at an outdoor cafe with his son and the son's friend, and all three were evaporated. President Trump's Justice Department claims it has a secret memorandum justifying the execution of these foreign persons. I say foreign persons, some could be Americans, we don't know. It won't reveal that memorandum. It won't reveal it to the Gang of Eight. That's the very unconstitutional, but followed Congress within a Congress. It won't reveal it in secret to the House or the Senate Intelligence Committees. This also is absurd. How could a legal argument be secret? There are no secret laws. The laws are enacted by Congress and published. We all know what the laws are. But apparently the DOJ and the Department of Defense, which today calls itself the Department of War, is afraid to reveal its legal justification, knowing that it will be eviscerated, because there can be no sound legal justification in American law for killing persons because of the Fifth Amendment. Life, liberty, or property of persons, they're entitled to due process. I think I'll stop at this point because I've been going for about a half an hour. I can see the great Professor Ebeling shaking his head one way or another, so I know he has some thoughts on his mind. And I welcome the Q, and hopefully you'll like the A.
Well, great presentation, Judge Napolitano. Absolutely fantastic. Let me begin by asking you to comment on just the overall purpose of the Bill of Rights, because I think most Americans don't really realize why our American ancestors felt it necessary. That, in other words, what is the biggest enemy of freedom that the American people face? And I think that the Bill of Rights reflects the answer to that question.
Well, the answer to that question is government.
Exactly. It's not some foreign regime or some foreign terrorist group.
Correct. The answer to that question is what the great Ludwig von Mises said. Government is essentially, at its core, the negation of liberty. Now, the Bill of Rights was originally written to restrain only the federal government. There was a modicum of state jealousy in there, and indeed, some states trampled the civil liberties of persons in those states and did so with not until the 14th Amendment, and I know it's highly controversial, and of course I condemn the Civil War, and I believe that Abraham Lincoln was a monster who slaughtered 750,000 Americans in order to preserve federal hegemony. Nevertheless, the 14th Amendment has been the linchpin to impose the Bill of Rights on the states. Some states, like my own home state, New Jersey, had their own Bill of Rights to which Madison referred when he crafted this. Not all states had it. Virginia did from the days when Thomas Jefferson was the colonial governor of Virginia. New York did, New Jersey did, Pennsylvania did not. So the Bill of Rights, though today the phrase Congress shall make no law means no government at any level shall make any law, originally only meant Congress. I'll give you an example, a horrific example close to my heart. During World War I, Princeton students went to the draft office in Trenton, New Jersey, the closest draft office to Princeton University, and they read the Declaration of Independence aloud outside the draft office. The president of the United States was the former governor of New Jersey and the former president of Princeton, Woodrow Wilson. He sent a young federal agent to arrest them. And when he was challenged for the arrest, he said, wait a minute, read the First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It says nothing about the power of the presidency. Well, today, of course, such a one-liner would flunk the course in constitutional law because the president doesn't make any laws. Fun fact, what was the name of the federal agent that Woodrow Wilson dispatched to Trenton to arrest his former students? John Edgar Hoover. Well, we all know what became of him.
Okay, Richard?
Yeah. In enumerating the Bill of Rights, as you did, for a very long time, there have been some conservatives, certainly classical liberals and libertarians, who have been, I'll say, disappointed, certainly frustrated, that the founding fathers never seemed to clearly or in an elaborated form emphasize the importance of the government staying out of the free market. That is, this recognition of the private property of an individual for him to use it peacefully and honestly for any production or consumption use that he had for it. And by not making something in some way explicit about a separation of economy and state, that was sort of a toe into through the entrance that has led to a point throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st century in which virtually nothing occurs within the marketplace that in some way is not directly or indirectly regulated, prohibited, subsidized, controlled, influenced by taxed government presence and enforcement. Can you give some thoughts or reflections on that? Why they didn't include that? Or if we were to move forward, how would we proceed to try to have that market liberty recognized and added to the Constitution?
You know, Bob Levy, formerly the chair of the Cato Institute, has a book called The Dirty Dozen. And they are the 12 worst Supreme Court opinions, and about 8 of them emanate from the New Deal, which, of course, is the beginning of federal regulation. I think that the founders and Madison particularly believed that the word property in the Fifth Amendment was the protection for interference, that the government shall not impair life, liberty, or property without due process of law, meaning not by legislation, not by regulation, not by embargo, not by taxation, but by proving you did something wrong with the property, which would mean criminal law and a jury trial. And that, of course, was the law of the land until, we'll get back to the Princeton professor, the Wilson era. The Madisonian view of the Constitution was that the federal government could only govern in the 16 unique, discrete areas articulated in Article 1 of the Constitution, giving powers to the Congress. And all other areas, as per the 10th Amendment, were reserved to the people or to the states. Wilson flipped that on his head. The Wilsonian view is that the federal government can govern in any area for which there is a national problem and national political will, except that which is expressly prohibited by the Constitution. So the Madison model, the Wilson model, is an inversion of the Madison model. Under the Madison model, Richard, the government needed the permission of either the states or the people or the courts to interfere with property in any way. Under the Wilsonian model, the people need the government's permission to do what they want with their own property. I'm exaggerating a little bit for the sake of simplicity, but if you study the New Deal cases and the modern court's reliance on them, you will see that value coming through the pages. In the Affordable Care Act case, this is the one where Chief Justice Roberts changed his mind the last minute. Justice Scalia, whose friendship with me during the last 10 years of his life was truly a gift. We talked on almost a weekly basis and had many, many, Jake, Italian meals with rich red wine together, told me that in the original draft of the Affordable Care Act case, when Roberts was on the side of what became the dissent, it would have been the majority, Wickard against Filburn, the worst of the dirty dozen, I'll explain it in a minute, was going to be repealed. Of course, it was never repealed and it's still there. Wickard versus Filburn allows the federal government to regulate even that which is immeasurable, even that which is minute, on the theory that if you add up a bunch of immeasurable or minute events in the aggregate, they could affect interstate commerce. This had to do with a farmer growing wheat in his field, and 100% of the wheat was being used by his wife to grind into flour to make bread. They didn't sell the bread, they ate the bread. But because they could have sold it, and because the water in his field in Ohio came from a river that originated in Indiana, you can't make this up, there were interstate implications, and therefore the federal government's regulation was upheld. One of the great losses of Justice Scalia's life, according to him, was that he never lived to see Wickard against Filburn reversed. I happen to know that Justice Barrett, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Thomas, and Justice Alito agree with that view. We need one more vote, and then this monstrosity and its progeny and its brothers and sisters from that era will go.
Okay, I'm reminded of that famous footnote in Wilkard versus Filburn that there's hardly lack of due process for the government to regulate that which it subsidizes. But let me turn your attention over to these drug war killings, Judge. It seems to me that a year ago, if the DEA started going out on the streets in the United States and started killing drug war suspects without arresting them, just shooting them on sight, that the federal courts would have immediately put a stop to that with some kind of injunctive relief. But now we have the president doing the same thing in international waters with the military. And you mentioned the problem of standing, but let's assume that one of the families of the people they've killed brings a wrongful death action in federal court against the U.S. government, claiming that they didn't have the legal authority to kill their loved one in that boat. What do you think the chances are of succeeding with that kind of lawsuit?
I think the court will not want to hear it and will throw it out on the standing grounds. I think it would take one of these survivors. It would take a person who truly was in harm's way to bring the action. The real remedial event here should be from Congress, but Congress is supine. Congress is almost a joke these days, particularly the way it's under the thumb of President Trump. So I would fear that such litigation would not prevail.
Richard?
I sort of want to ask sort of a broader brushstroke question. Given the directions that these matters have all gone for over 100 years ago, for 100 years now, and the particular climate we're in now, where the progressives have their own vision of the command and regulated and controlled and planned society, and there are the people among the Republicans and the MAGA and the nationalist conservatives who have their own versions of the planned, regulated, controlled society and culture. With realizing that we only know the past, and we're all looking through the future with through a glass darkly. What do you see as the prospects for liberty in the constitutional sense, in the way we as advocates of freedom normally speak of it? What do you see as the prospects of liberty looking in let's say, the next decade or years ahead?
Why, Richard, I'm not sanguine about that at all. I believe that in the next 50 or 60 years, the federal government will collapse of its own weight and won't be able to pay its debts. Nobody will lend it any money, and nobody will believe that its money is worth anything. That the debt will be unsustainable, and the former United States of America will break off into a variety of small republics, Northeast, Middle Atlantic, Southwest, Southeast. You can use your imagination as to how they'll break up, and some of them will have more freedom than others, just by virtue of the value judgments and the culture of the people that live there. New England will be more regulated than Texas. Florida will be less regulated than New Jersey. But if one expects that a Supreme Court of Neil Gorsuch's, Justice Gorsuch being the only person who could even be called a libertarian sometimes, is going to effectively recraft the federal government so that it shrinks down into the chains of the Constitution, Jefferson's phrase, not going to happen.
Judge, you mentioned the New Deal and monetary issues, and would you comment on what happened there in the New Deal with Roosevelt and our monetary system? We'd been operating under a gold coin, silver coin standard for over 100 years. The Constitution calls for that. And here was Roosevelt suddenly changing the entire monetary system of the United States without a constitutional amendment. Can you comment on that?
Another funny conversation I had with Justice Scalia, in which I said, hey, Nino, is paper money constitutional? And he looked at me and said, well, of course not. We'll just hope to God that doesn't come before the court, because if we rule the way we should rule, there'll be a catastrophe on our hands, and I don't want to be responsible for that catastrophe. Not a bad imitation. The governments, the courts have never ruled on the constitutionality of the Federal Reserve. The courts have never ruled on the constitutionality of many of the banking regulations, which control everything that we do, the value of the money in our pockets. Ron Paul has a great piece out this week. If you can't afford a vacation this summer, blame the Federal Reserve, in which he calculates how the value of the dollar has shrunk so radically. because of all of the printing of cash and injection of fiat money into the money supply. So this brings me back to Richard's question. I'm just not sanguine about any of this at all. I don't know if I answered your question, if I'm just bemoaning what we're going through.
All right, well, Richard, why don't you give us one last question and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. Given the concerns and the uncertainties that you've just expressed, I have too. The particular extreme forms that Trump has been attempting to extend executive authority, from sending National Guards unwanted to patrol and enforce streets in various cities, the business that he's doing in the Caribbean, the rounding up of those viewed as illegals and undeserving to be in the United States in rather often brutal and certainly arbitrary ways, in which American citizens get caught in those nets in various instances. There has been a recourse, even from Democrats, about, this is exceeding the presidential authority on civil rights. This is an abridgment, I believe these words out of their mouths, states' rights. And even some conservatives have expressed concerns about these extensions. Do you think that this can lead to at least marginal backlashes on these extensions of federal and particularly executive authority? Or is it more likely that once Trump is out of office or the tables turn on him in terms of who controls Congress next year, that it'll all just go back and the Democrats won't give a damn about any of this, and the conservatives will mumble the rhetoric about freedom, will just go back onto their own path?
Unfortunately, I would embrace or believe that the latter is more likely than the former. Richard, I've been saying for years, Jake has heard me say this, that we don't have two political parties. We have one uniparty. They both like war. They both like debt. They both like more power. The Democrats like to do this with the cash. The Republicans like to do that with the cash. I don't really think it matters who's in there. It might be nice if one house were controlled by the other party from the White House, just to temper his excesses a little bit. But if Gavin Newsom is elected president in 2028, look for him to use the same powers that he complains about. And I don't mean to pick on him, but just as an example, look for him to use the same powers that he's complaining about Trump using now. In their famous letters back and forth before the two of them died on the same day, as we all know, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson writes to Adams, in the long march of history, government grows and liberty shrinks. That's true. It was true then, and it's true today. And he also said, maybe we need a revolution once in every generation.
On that insightful note, we'll wrap things up. Judge, if people want to access your podcast, what's the best way to do that?
I am so blessed with the podcast. It's called Judging Freedom. You can watch it almost anywhere, but most people watch it on YouTube. This year on YouTube alone, you ready for this number? 100 million views.
Wow.
I won't tell you what that is more than, but one of them is a network that employs me. It will not reach 100 million views in 2025. So by presenting an alternative view, and I don't discuss the Constitution, I discuss foreign affairs. We present an alternative view on Gaza, an alternative view on Ukraine, an alternative view on Israel, on Russia. Almost all of the people on my podcast were on mainstream television until their cable television, until their views diverged from management. So the views you hear on Judging Freedom, you won't hear or see in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or Fox News or ABC, CBS, NBC, or CNN.
And would people access that show live, or is it recorded and then later posted?
Yeah, both. You can access it live. The schedule's posted each day, but they're also up there forever. There's over 5,000 episodes. They're not long. They range from 20 to 30 minutes in length. They're all posted and they're all there. Just go to Judging Freedom or go to judgenap.com and you'll find them.
Okay, and that's where the schedule is also for people.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, it's just absolutely phenomenal and very impressive what you've accomplished with that. It's nice that the internet is and has enabled people to share the truth that the mainstream media simply will not share with people. And
You got that right.
in a fantastic way.
What a pleasure to be with you guys. My only regret is that we're not in the same room together. And I also know that Richard knows very fine restaurants, so we could repair to a very nice restaurant now if we were all together. I don't know where you guys are. I'm in New York City. Where are you, Jacob?
I'm in Northern Virginia.
And Richard, where are you?
I'm actually on the campus of the Citadel because I teach. So I'm in Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay, well, Charleston has wonderful restaurants, so maybe we'll do it at one of those next time.
And I'll just add, Jacob, if I could just add one other thing. As you were saying before we actually began, Andrew, we haven't seen each other face to face in a lot of years. Do you have a portrait of Dorian Gray in your attic? Because you get younger and more youthful as the years go by.
Well, you're very kind. I worked very hard at it, but we can resolve the not seeing each other. I would be thrilled to give a lecture to one of your classes, and it'll be an excuse for me to come to Charleston.
Actually, let me arrange for you to come and speak to the Citadel, a body of the students in general at the Citadel. They would
not too long ago. I addressed the Citadel's competition. I forget the name of the school in Virginia, and the whole student body was there, and it was wonderful.
All right,
well, let's try to put that in motion.
That would be fantastic.
VMI is the name of that other school. You probably know it. They're bitter rivals.
Well, that's my alma mater.
Right.
So, right. Did you say you spoke at VMI?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes. A couple of years ago, I spoke to the entire student body and then did a seminar for a smaller group on one of their constitutional law classes. Did the same at West Point many times.
Well, that's extremely impressive. Okay. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Judge, I just can't tell you what a pleasure this has been and what an honor it is to have you on here at the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm sure that our viewers and listeners are going to greatly enjoy this discussion. Richard, as always, it was a great pleasure to exchange ideas on liberty with you, and look forward to seeing you next week when we have the final speaker in our series, The Critical Importance of Civil Liberties, the great Ron Paul.
Oh, he is a great human being. And I met him when he was in the audience at one of your Future Freedom Foundations. And all of a sudden I said, you'll remember what I said, ladies and gentlemen, I have to stop what I'm saying because I just realized the Thomas Jefferson of our day is in this audience. And a red-faced but beaming Ron Paul stood up and waved. And I went down there and kissed him. And there began our wonderful friendship.
I remember that. It was a magical night that night when you and Ron were speaking on the same evening. It was fantastic. And it's all there on our website at the multimedia section. Okay, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all again. And until the next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.